Welcome, my friends, to Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. We are joined today by Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky, and we are actually doing our first bonus episode right now. First, I want to congratulate you, Rabbi Sinensky, on the publishing of Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamm's archives. It is a remarkable resource. It'll be linked in the show notes for all of our listeners. And in honor of this special occasion, I actually want to get to a little bit of an addendum to our not so long ago episode we did on Rabbi Lamm. A quick refresher for our listeners. We had a discussion about whether Kohanim who are not observing Shabbos can duchen. We used it as a way of speaking about Rabbi Norman Lamm in general, but what we didn't really get into was perhaps some of his most famous Bali Plukta, Rabbi Gifter in particular. So we're going to take a few minutes right now. I want to hear about it because I remember always growing up in the more yeshivish Welt, and there was always this legendary tape or a mythical tape, because I've never actually heard it, called Gifter Slaughters Lamb. Very irreverent. It gets a few smirks. They had apparently a very interesting relationship, we could call it. So I was hoping maybe you could just tell us a little bit about their machlokes in this particular sugya that we discussed previously, and also just the nature of the Rabbi Lamm, Rabbi Gifter relationship that maybe the Hamonam, including myself, doesn't fully grasp.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to come back on and to discuss this piece of the conversation as well. So I too, in my own way, coming from perhaps the other side, if you will, learned about it certainly when I was in college. Gifter slaughters lamb for Passover. It's a Chol Hamoed Pesach talk, 1988. You can still find the YouTube online. It's out there.
Is it
So
well, the real question is, will it be in the Rabbi Lamm archives?
I don't think we have rishus to do so, but we'll contact the Gifter family and ask. You never know. But it's still up there. It hasn't been taken down. And at that time, the big controversy had to do with a talk that Rabbi Lamm gave about the legitimacy, validity, standing of non-Orthodox rabbis in the community at that time. He delivered a talk around a month or two earlier at Fifth Avenue Synagogue. It was then reported on in the New York Times, and then many in the right-leaning community were highly critical of Rabbi Lamm, including Rabbi Gifter, at that famous or infamous talk, depending, I guess, on your perspective. That I knew. But what I didn't know was that they had had a relationship going back for some 30 years prior that sheds light on why it is, on how it is that Rev Gifter came to slaughter Rabbi Lamm for Passover. This wasn't their first go around.
So Rabbi Gifter is at Tells at this time. Just a little
Yeah,
bit of background on Rev Gifter, maybe for those who aren't familiar.
sure. Rev Gifter is one of the two Rosh Yeshiva at Tells. He's also just a tremendous Talmud Chacham. I believe he's a member of the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah as well, and that's part of the context for him slaughtering Rabbi Lamm for Passover and speaking out against him. There was this sense from the Aguda, the leadership of the Aguda in general, that Rabbi Lamm, at least as reported, had overstepped. Yeah, so all of that I knew, as I say, but what's fascinating is that this topic that occasioned Rabbi Lamm's article on Hadaron that we discussed on the previous episode about Kohanim reciting Birchas Kohanim, Duchening, even for someone who's a Mechala Shabbos, actually occasioned a letter in response from Rav Gifter back in 1959 on Yud Bet Tishrei of that year. He says, I read the most recent article in Hadarom, and he says, I don't agree. What irked him the most was not Rabbi Lamm's practical halachic argument. In fact, Rav Gifter doesn't touch at all on the question of Kohanim reciting Berachas Kohanim, which is interesting. Maybe he knew Rav Moshe had his own concerns, but whatever it might have been, as we discussed in the previous episode, I'm not sure why he does not go there at all. But he doesn't. That's just the fact of the matter. What irks him the most is Rabbi Lamm's more independent-minded, even maverick reading of the Rambam. The way Rabbi Lamm reads the Rambam is he basically says, well, if an idolater is precluded from reciting Berachas Kohanim, someone who violates Shabbos is equated by the Rambam to someone who worships idolatry, and therefore such an individual is also precluded as a mumar, someone who is basically defiant with respect to the observance of mitzvot, and therefore may not recite Birchas Kohanim. This leads Rabbi Lamm to the conclusion that even someone who worshipped Avodah Zarah or who violated Shabbos intentionally actually is not able, in most circumstances at least, to even do tshuva.
Ooh.
This is a radical conclusion that once you've done so, you're precluded for eternity. Now, don't worry, right? We're going to be okay, Rabbi Lamm then argues, but that's not our Kohanim. Our Kohanim are not trying to do this l'hachis. They're not trying to do this in a rebellious fashion. They do care about Shabbos. They are coming to shul. They're reciting Kiddush, etc. And therefore, none of this conversation applies to them, and it's only academic. And he adds that this is not the reading of the Pri Megadim, but what can I do? B'mchilach kvod taraso, Rabbi Lamm disagrees. He says, look, I have the words of the Rambam. This is what I think he says, but it doesn't matter for our purposes because, again, it doesn't apply to our Kohanim, as we discussed in the previous episode. This comment about the Pri Megadim, I think, if I'm reading Rav Gifter's response correctly, and all of this appears in the archives, and just we can link it in the show notes. Everyone can find these conversations now. They're live for the community of Lomdei Torah and people who are interested in Rabbi Lamm's legacy and the larger community's legacy. Rav Gifter says you're misreading the Rambam. You've misunderstood the whole argument. The reason that someone who's an idolater is precluded from reciting Birchas Kohanim is because it's a special halacha that is derived from a pasuk in the Gemara having to do with someone who's an idolater. And therefore, since it's not a law of mumar, it's not a law of someone who is specifically trying to preclude themselves or to intentionally violate the laws of the Torah. Therefore, such an individual is not going to be precluded from reciting Birchas Kohanim. Therefore, he says this whole claim that in theory, someone who's Mechalel Shabbos is going to be precluded if they do so intentionally and rebelliously is going to be precluded for all eternity. That he says is not correct. And that's what the Pri Megadim was trying to say. And he concludes his letter to Rabbi Lamm on page 3. He says, in the end of the day, Sofo shel davar, responding to ha'ikar, she'in lanu lazuz midivrei hashas v'rabosinu hakadmonim. We should not abandon the holy words of the Gemara and our predecessors, aleinu rak lahavin divrei hema kedoshim, kemo shenimseru. This, I think, is the key. It's the way that I have the Pri Megadim learned it. It's the way that my Rebbeim taught me how to read the Rambam. Stick with that, you young whippersnapper lamb. Don't try to come up with your own baich svaros, okay? Don't get too fancy. And he even says, he says, "V'lo l'chadesh svaros mida'atinu," not to innovate logic on our own. Af shetzilzul haspero yafeh v'na'imhu. Even though the ring sounds appealing, he says. He says it might sound nice, but that doesn't make for Amita Shel Torah.
That's some good Lipvisha Musar right there.
Yeah, right there. Yeah, and he signs very respectfully, though. He says, this is mitoch lan be'omka shel halacha. This is not, mitoch tza'akat, yagon shel ohavei Torah, and those who uphold it. This is not, it's a protest, but it's a mild one. It's not a kol koreh to the community.
So just help me understand. Is this the first time that Rev Gifter and Rabbi Lamm go at it? I mean, do we know where they initially meet each other and how this all developed? I'm trying to get this the context over here.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if anyone knows at this point. Rav Gifter does not say Rabbi Lamm sent this to me, or we were discussing this previously. He doesn't reference anything prior. This letter could stand on its own. What he says is, I recently I picked up a copy of Hadarom. I read it in the most recent edition, and I wanted to express some concerns. So whether I
find it interesting also that Rav Gifter is reading Hadarom being an RCA publication. I imagine most Rabbanim in the Agudas Yisrael kind of world are not picking up RCA publications typically.
Yes, I don't know. Again, he doesn't necessarily mention. He was known as a little bit of a kanai, so it's possible that he was, he was looking for something. it's quite possible that someone turned his attention to it. Someone who's involved in these issues had heard that there's some controversial article by this young rabbi out in Springfield. Perhaps they brought it to his attention, but your guess is as good as mine. I just don't think we know.
So is it all essentially downhill from there? I mean, just throughout the years,
And
basically.
so there are two more contexts in which we now know based on the archives. Again, I had never known any of this personally from Rabbi Lamm or seen this in any books or anything like that, but it's all there in the history. So the first is that over a few occasions, Rav Gifter writes on letterhead, as opposed to these letters that I'm describing now, which are all on personal pieces of paper. On letterhead, he writes fundraising letters to Rabbi Lamm, especially, I think we only have them from when Rabbi Lamm is in the Jewish Center, which makes sense. The Jewish Center was known as a very wealthy community, and I think that forgive me for my cynicism here, but they may have transcended all machlokas. I don't know.
Hakesef
I
Yanes
don't have a
Hakol.
fundraising letter after 1988 for Rabbi Lamm had long left. What did you say, Rickard?
Is
Sorry.
it a Hakesef Yanes Hakol?
I don't know. But long after this exchange and the one other that I'll describe, he writes those letters. That's one. But actually, there's one more. In 1968, in addition to a formal tzedakah request from the shul on institutional letterhead from the Telzer Yeshiva in Cleveland, he also writes him in private about a report that had been published in Panim El Panim. So you ask what Rav Gifter is reading. This is an Israeli journal. It sounds from Rabbi Lamb's response that maybe Rav Gifter was in Israel at the time. I'm not sure as to the background, but regardless, he reads a journal called Panim El Panim, which is, the best of my knowledge, more or less a religious Zionist-oriented type of journal, which was edited by someone named Pinchas Pelly, who was a close friend of Rabbi Lamm, and later published Rav Soloveitchik's Tshuva lectures, Ala Tshuva. He's the one who compiled that particular work with the Rav's gushpanka, with his support and his agreement. In 1968, Panim El Panim publishes a report of a lecture that Rabbi Lamm had delivered in Jerusalem that was understood by the reporter to be a broadside against the Haredi community for essentially hiding themselves in caves. Now, this is very interesting and a little bit confusing because much later on, almost 20 years later, we have the cavemen controversy. But this is essentially the same drasha, the same talk that Rabbi Lamm gave 18 years later that then became the famed caveman controversy, about which, to the best of my knowledge, Rav Gifter didn't respond, but maybe there's something I don't know
Just
there.
a quick recollection
Others
here.
do.
The caveman
Yeah,
controversy
please.
was he accused the Haredi world of being cavemen, like
So
Rishon Bar
yeah,
Yochai
I
or
was about to
something.
explain that was the perception, at least. I don't think that that's at all what he meant. But you can look. He's actually, as he always was throughout his career, he was very open and honest. He said, "This is what some accused me of. This is what I actually said in the talk." And he publishes in his 70 Faces, which is a 2-volume compilation of many of his popular essays and talks. And he says, "I'm not even going to get into the mud with anyone. You can go see the text somewhere else. You can read the original. I was accused of claiming that this broadside against the Haredim, and you can read it and see if you
As
agree
a
or
pulpit
disagree."
rabbi,
Yeah,
I find it very relatable.
he was very diplomatic, and at the time he was president of Yeshiva University, but he had no interest in getting into this tussle. Who would it benefit? So you go choose. So that's in very brief the caveman controversy 18 years later. The kernel of that talk, it turns out, he had delivered from the pulpit. There's a very similar sermon that he gave, as well as apparently he had delivered in Yerushalayim, and that was written up in Panim El Panim with a similar argument. Basically, Rabbi Shimon ben Bar Yochai and his son Rabbi Elazar are in the cave for a dozen years. They come out, they burn everything aflame with their eyes. The Kadosh Baruch Hu says, "You came out of your cave in order solami, right, in order to destroy my world. Go back into the cave for another year." And once they chill, they're able to emerge successfully into the quote unquote real world, for lack of a better term.
Hmm.
And so that report gets to Rav Gifter, and again, 18 years prior to the classic caveman controversy, we have caveman number one. And that first bout is very similar. He says to Rabbi Lamm, and this is interesting, he doesn't say, you claimed or you proclaimed us to be cavemen. What he does say, though, is basically the way that it was, I assume, misreported, Rabbi Lamm, in the paper, but you might want to clarify, is that we're a bunch of cavemen. And you might want to just explain to to people, to readers of Panim El Panim and anyone
Oh,
else who's listening, that that's not
that's
actually
actually very
what you meant.
diplomatic.
It was relatively diplomatic, and that's what I think is very interesting. But he does use relatively sharp language. I apologize, I don't have it right here. Everyone can go see it again for themselves on the site, but there is some sharper language. So I think that there are a few things that are happening here. There's a larger communal kind of transition where first Rabbi Lamm is just this guy in the boondocks in Springfield, and then he's a rabbi at the Jewish Center in the heart of Manhattan, a very prominent mono-Orthodox shul, and then he's the president of Yeshiva University, of course, and so the stakes are higher. His pulpit is more public, he has greater sway. And so, on one level, I think this is about Rabbi Lamm's increasing public influence and the need, or the perceived need at least, for Rabbanim to speak out increasingly clearly and firmly against him. That's one piece. But I think there's also a personal relationship here. And again, there may be, as you say, pieces that we don't yet have. Maybe those will appear in the Yeshiva University archives. There's a lot more material. The Jewish Center, there's still material. I haven't seen any of that because Rabbi Lamm left over 200,000 pieces of paper in his personal archive
Oh my
upon his
gosh.
passing. That kept me busy for the last little while. So I thought that was enough to get the website up and running. So maybe there's more material out there. Maybe, again, a listener or scholar out there that I haven't spoken with yet has some insight. But I do think that you have a personal relationship. First, it's a letter, a very gentle but pretty firm still letter to the young Rabbi Lamm, and then a little bit of a stronger letter in 1968. And then finally, right, kind of the apex is a public talk that, of course, we have when Gifter slaughters lamb for Passover in 1988.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll get that recording into the archives because I've heard it referenced a million times, but I've never been able to listen to it. So we'll see if we get it up there. But to our
Well,
listeners, please make sure to check out the new Rabbi Norman Lamm archives. And Yasher Koach to you for making this available. Lezakos Rabim. Yasher Koach, Rabbi Sinensky.
thank you so much, Rabbi Kurtz, for having me on again.
Absolutely.